This is the moment a 12-year-old girl learned that telling the truth doesn't always matter. She sat in that courtroom, hands folded, holding on to the one thing her grandfather left her, a Navy SEAL challenge coin. When she mentioned him, tried to explain where she learned about courage, the judge didn't ask questions. He mocked her, in front of everyone, called her a liar for saying her grandfather served. The room laughed. She went silent. What the judge didn't know was that some names carry weight, even after death, and that his words were already being documented, reported, and sent to people who don't forget. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories about quiet justice and unseen legacies matter to you, consider subscribing. Because what happened next would dismantle everything that Judge built, one silent email at a time. The fluorescent lights in the third-floor waiting room buzzed with a frequency that made everything feel slightly unreal. Ember Calloway sat perfectly still on a plastic chair bolted to the linoleum floor, her hands folded in her lap, thumbs moving in small circles against something hidden in her pocket. The clock on the wall read 2:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, and the building smelled like old paper and industrial cleaning solution. Down the hall, a child was crying. The sound echoed off the walls and then stopped abruptly when a door closed. Lorelei Gott sat beside her, reviewing paperwork with the focused attention of someone who had learned not to make promises she couldn't keep. She was Ember's caseworker, the fourth one in 18 months, and she had kind eyes that didn't try to hide the fact that she'd seen too many kids slip through cracks in the system. Her pen made a rhythmic clicking sound as she worked through the forms, occasionally glancing at Ember with an expression that might have been concern or might have been practiced professionalism. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. Ember was 12 years old and wearing clothes that were clean but clearly borrowed. The dress shoes were half a size too big. She'd stuffed tissue paper in the toes that morning so they wouldn't slip off when she walked. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that Geneva Threadgill, her current foster mother, had helped her with before they left the house. Geneva had squeezed her shoulder and told her to just tell the truth, that the truth always mattered. Ember wanted to believe that. The waiting room had 6 other people scattered across the rows of chairs. Another caseworker was typing on her phone. A man in a suit that looked expensive sat reading a folder with the bored expression of someone who did this every day. 2 women sat together near the window, speaking in low voices about a case that wasn't going well. Nobody looked at Ember directly, but she could feel their awareness of her presence the way you feel someone watching you from across a room. She was a case number, a file, a decision waiting to be made. Her fingers tightened around the object in her pocket. It was smooth from years of handling, warm from her body heat, and it was the only proof she had that she wasn't making things up. But she hadn't decided yet if she would show it. Maybe if they asked, maybe if it mattered, maybe if anyone cared enough to actually listen instead of just hearing what they expected to hear. Lorelei's pen stopped clicking. She looked up from her paperwork and studied Ember's face with the careful attention of someone reading a map in a foreign language. After a moment, she spoke without looking away. "You don't have to be nervous. Judge Grimshaw just wants to hear from you directly about what you want." That was all. No explanation of who Judge Grimshaw was, or what kind of person asked questions in family court, or whether wanting something actually made any difference when 12 other factors weighed heavier on a custody scale. Ember's voice came out quieter than she intended. "What if what I want doesn't matter?" It wasn't really a question, more like a statement of experience, and Lorelei heard the difference. She closed her folder and turned in her chair so they were facing each other properly, not just sitting side by side like strangers on a bus. "It matters," Lorelei said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as Ember. The silence that followed felt heavy. Somewhere in the building, a phone was ringing and nobody was answering it. The crying child from earlier had gone quiet. The clock ticked forward to 2:51 p.m. Ember nodded because that was what you did when adults told you things were going to be okay. You nodded and you kept your hands still, and you tried not to let them see how much you'd learned about the gap between what people said and what actually happened. She'd been in 3 foster homes before the Threadgills. The first one had been fine until it wasn't. The second one had too many other kids and not enough attention to go around. The third one had rules about everything, including how you were supposed to feel, and Ember had learned that some structures were just cages with better lighting. The Threadgills were different. Geneva cooked meals that everyone ate together. Her husband Marco fixed things around the house and asked Ember about school without making it feel like an interrogation. Their two other foster kids, an 8-year-old named Petra and a 14-year-old named Simon, treated her like an actual sister instead of competition for limited resources. For 7 months, Ember had felt something she didn't have a name for. Something like stability. Something like the possibility that maybe this time it would last. But now she was sitting in a courthouse waiting room because someone had decided it was time to review her placement. And the word review never meant they were planning to leave things alone. It meant questions, assessments, decisions made by people who had never eaten dinner at the Threadgill table or seen the way Geneva left the hallway, light on at night, because Ember still didn't like the dark. A door opened down the hall. A bailiff stepped out, clipboard in hand, and looked at the waiting room with the expression of someone calling numbers at a deli counter. Calloway hearing, Courtroom 4B. His voice was flat and professional and gave no indication that he cared one way or another about what happened inside that room. He was just moving people through a system, case after case, day after day. Ember stood. Her legs felt unsteady for a moment, and she pressed her hand against her pocket to feel the outline of the coin through the fabric. Lorelei gathered her paperwork and stood beside her. They walked down the hallway together, past closed doors with frosted glass windows and plaques that said things like Mediation Room C and Family Services Office. The floor tiles were scuffed from years of people, walking this same path, carrying their own files and their own fears. Courtroom 4B was smaller than Ember had imagined. She'd seen courtrooms on television that looked important, with high ceilings and wood paneling that spoke of gravity and justice. This room looked tired. The paneling was dark and made everything feel heavy. The judge's bench was elevated, deliberately higher than everything else, and behind it sat Judge Phineas Grimshaw. He was in his late 50s with graying hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. He wore a black robe and an expensive watch that caught the light when he moved his wrist. Everything about him communicated control, the way he sat, the way he held his pen, the way his eyes moved across the paperwork in front of him without any visible rush or concern. He looked like a man who had been doing this job long enough that individual cases had stopped being people and had become problems to be sorted into categories. The gallery held maybe 6 people. Another caseworker Ember didn't recognize, a court-appointed attorney who had introduced himself once and then disappeared into paperwork, a guardian ad litem who was supposed to represent Ember's interests but had only spoken to her for 15 minutes before this hearing. 2 administrative observers in the back row taking notes for reasons nobody had explained. None of them looked at Ember when she entered. They were looking at their own files, their own notes, their own versions of a story that might or might not match the truth. The bailiff gestured to a chair. Ember sat. Lorelei took the seat beside her and arranged her folders on the table with quiet efficiency. The court reporter was already positioned at her stenograph machine, fingers resting on the keys, waiting. The room smelled like old coffee and the particular kind of silence that happens when people are professionally pretending to care. Judge Grimshaw didn't look up immediately. He finished reading whatever was in front of him, made a notation with his pen, and then removed his glasses with the slow deliberation of someone who enjoyed making people wait. When he finally looked at Ember, his expression was neutral in a way that felt worse than hostility. It was the look of someone who had already decided what kind of person she was before she'd opened her mouth. Case number F2024-7738, he said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to being the most important person in any room. In the matter of Ember Calloway, continued custody review. He glanced at her over the rim of his glasses. "You're 12. "Yes, sir," Ember said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "And you've been in foster care with," he paused to check his notes, "the Threadgill family for 7 months. Previous placements include 3 separate homes over 18 months. He looked at her again, and this time there was something in his expression that made her stomach tighten. "You understand we're here to determine whether the current arrangement should remain in place or if alternative options better serve your interests." "Yes, sir." "You'll need to speak up," he said, and there was a sharpness in his tone that hadn't been there before. The court reporter can't record mumbling. It wasn't a request. It was a correction, a reminder that she was in his space, under his rules, and everything she said or didn't say would be measured against standards she didn't fully understand. Lorelei started to say something, but Grimshaw held up one finger without looking at her. The gesture was small but absolute, a stop sign that didn't need words. Lorelei closed her mouth and settled back in her chair. Ember's hand moved to her pocket again, fingers finding the edges of the coin through the fabric. Now, Grimshaw continued, turning pages in the file with the slow precision of someone who wanted you to know he was in control of the pace. I've read the social worker's report. Says you've expressed a desire to stay with the Threadgills, but I also see concerning notes, difficulty adjusting to structure, reluctance to engage with school counselors, described as withdrawn. He looked at her over his glasses. Does that sound accurate? Ember thought about the way words could be arranged to tell a story that was technically true, but completely wrong. She thought about the school counselor who had asked her questions during lunch period, when all she wanted was to eat her sandwich in peace. She thought about the structure that some adults confused with safety, when really it was just another word for control. I don't think I'm withdrawn, she said carefully. I just listen more than I talk. Grimshaw's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles were supposed to feel cold. And what have you been listening to? It wasn't really a question, it was a setup, and Ember didn't know enough to avoid it. Her fingers closed around the coin in her pocket. She felt the raised edges of the trident, worn smooth from years of handling. Things my grandpa taught me, she said. Before. Before what? Before he died. The words came out flat, and she wished immediately that she'd said it differently, that she'd found a way to make him understand that when she said before, she meant before everything changed. Before the phone call that came in the middle of the night. Before the funeral with the flag and the strangers in uniform. Before she learned that some losses were so big, they reorganized your entire understanding of what safety meant. Grimshaw was writing something down, his pen moving across the page with practiced efficiency. He didn't look up when he spoke. I see. And what did your grandfather teach you? His tone suggested he was already bored with this line of conversation, that he was doing her a favor by pretending to care. This was the moment. Ember could feel it. She could say something safe and generic. She could talk about being kind or working hard or any of the things that adults wanted to hear from children in courtrooms. But Geneva's voice was in her head, telling her to just tell the truth. And Ember had spent 7 months learning that maybe the truth was worth the risk. He taught me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, she said, her voice stronger now. It means you do the thing anyway. He said, courage is, she paused, searching for the exact words because they mattered. He called it moving through the fear. She could see him saying it, standing in the kitchen of the apartment they had shared, flipping pancakes on Sunday mornings, telling her stories that she hadn't understood were lessons until much later. Grimshaw made a non-committal sound and kept writing. Uh-huh. Inspirational grandfather, noted. The dismissiveness in his tone was a physical thing. Ember felt it land like a weight in her chest. But she'd started now, and some part of her needed him to understand that she wasn't making this up, that the person she'd lost was real and mattered and had taught her things that were still keeping her upright. He would know, she said, and her hand tightened around the coin. He served in the Navy. He was a SEAL. He did 28 years and... The pen stopped moving. Grimshaw looked up slowly, removing his glasses with theatrical precision. He placed them on the bench in front of him, with the careful attention of someone setting down a weapon. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice had changed. There was something sharp in it now, something that enjoyed what was about to happen. He was a what? A Navy SEAL, Ember said, and she heard how it sounded. How impossible it must seem to someone who was looking at a 12-year-old foster kid with no stability and 3 failed placements. Commander Will. A Navy SEAL, Grimshaw repeated, and now he was turning slightly toward the gallery, not looking at them directly, but making sure they were paying attention, making sure they understood that something entertaining was about to happen. Ms. Calloway, I've been on this bench for 14 years. Do you know how many children have sat in that chair and told me their absent parent was a secret agent, an MMA fighter, a movie star? But he really, Ember started, but Grimshaw kept talking over her. Let me guess, he said, and there was cruelty in his tone now, barely disguised as pedagogy. He also told you he worked for the CIA. Maybe he was an astronaut on weekends. The gallery made small sounds, not quite laughter, but close enough. The administrative observers were writing things down. The court-appointed attorney was looking at his hands. Lorelei stood up. "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may not," Grimshaw said, sharp and final. He turned back to Ember, and his expression was the face of someone who believed he was teaching an important lesson. "Here's what I teach children in my courtroom. Honesty. I understand that you want to stay with your current placement. I understand you might feel saying certain things will help your case, but fabricating a military hero grandfather undermines everything we're trying to accomplish here." "I'm not lying," Ember said, and her voice broke on the last word. She hated that. Hated that he could make her sound weak when she was telling the truth. "Then prove it," Grimshaw said, leaning forward slightly. "Oh, wait. You can't. Because you're asking me to believe a 12-year-old foster child with no stability, no documentation in your file, and no mention of this supposed war hero from any previous caseworker." He paused for effect. "Just happened to be raised by a Navy SEAL." The silence that followed felt like falling. Ember stopped talking entirely. Her hand came out of her pocket, empty, and she folded both hands in her lap the way she'd been taught. The tears were starting, hot and humiliating, and she would not let them fall. She would not give him that. She sat completely still, looking at her lap, and something inside her went quiet in a way that felt permanent. "Now," Grimshaw said, his voice returning to its professional register, as if nothing had happened, "let's discuss what's actually in your file, and why the court believes a more structured environment might better serve your long-term stability and development." He was back to reading his notes, back to the routine, and Ember had become invisible again. But she wasn't invisible to everyone. The court reporter's fingers were still moving across the stenograph, recording every word. One of the administrative observers in the back row was writing something on a notepad, underlining it twice. Later, much later, that note would matter. Right now it was just ink on paper. Right now, it was just one person in a room full of people who had heard a child tell the truth and watched an authority figure call her a liar. The hearing continued. Grimshaw asked questions about school attendance and behavioral reports and psychological assessments. Lorelei provided answers with professional precision, her voice carefully neutral, but Ember could hear the tension underneath. The guardian ad litem made a statement about the need for stability. The court-appointed attorney said something about considering all options. None of it registered. Ember was somewhere else, somewhere far away from courtroom 4B, and she was thinking about her grandfather's apartment, about the challenge coin he'd carried every day, about the photograph on his dresser of the two of them at the beach, about the way he'd said her name. The hearing ended, the gavel came down. Grimshaw would make his decision within 2 weeks. Everyone stood when he left the bench. The bailiff opened a door, and the room began to empty. Lorelei touched Ember's shoulder gently, and they walked out together into the hallway. It was 3:45 p.m. now. An hour had passed, but it felt longer. The hallway was empty except for a man in a maintenance uniform changing a light bulb. Lorelei guided Ember to a bench against the wall, and they sat down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lorelei crouched in front of her so they were eye level. "You did nothing wrong," she said, and her voice was fierce in a way Ember hadn't heard before. "Do you hear me? Nothing. That was not about you. That was about him. About his ego and his assumptions and his complete failure to do his job properly." Ember looked at her. "He didn't believe me?" "That's not your fault," Lorelei said. She hesitated, then asked the question that mattered. "Your grandfather, Commander William Patterson, that's his real name." Ember nodded. "Do you have anything? Documentation, service records, something that proves it?" For a long moment, Ember just looked at her. Then slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the thing she'd been holding all afternoon. She held it out on her palm. It was a Navy SEAL challenge coin. Gold trident worn smooth from years of handling. The metal caught the fluorescent light. On one side, the SEAL insignia. On the reverse, an engraving. CDRWH Patterson. Bud S. Class. 187. The only easy day was yesterday. Lorelei took it carefully, the way you hold something fragile and important. She studied both sides, her expression changing as she read the inscription. She turned it over again, looking at the wear patterns that only came from years of someone carrying it every single day. When she looked up at Ember, her eyes were different, sharper, more focused. "Why didn't you show him this?" she asked. Ember's answer was simple and devastating. "He didn't ask to see it. He just decided I was lying." Lorelei stared at the coin for another moment, then pulled out her phone. She photographed both sides, multiple angles, making sure the engraving was clear in every shot. Then she handed the coin back to Ember with a gentleness that acknowledged what it meant. "I'm going to make some calls," Lorelei said. "Administrative ones, for your file." She stood up, and there was something in her posture now that hadn't been there before. Something that looked like purpose. "Ember, look at me." Ember met her eyes. "Sometimes the truth takes time to catch up," Lorelei said, "but it always does." That evening, at 7:15 p.m., Marisol Paith sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open. She'd been a court reporter for 16 years and had learned to separate her job from her feelings. You had to, or the weight of other people's tragedies would crush you. But some cases stayed with you. Some moments lodged themselves in your memory and refused to leave. Her husband Duncan was cooking dinner, the sound of chopping vegetables rhythmic and familiar. She hadn't planned to say anything. Court proceedings were supposed to stay in court, but the words came out anyway. "You ever heard a judge mock a kid in open court?" she said. Duncan looked up from the cutting board. "Happens. Not like this." She said her grandfather was a SEAL. Judge basically called her a liar in front of everyone, made her cry. Duncan went back to chopping, but his movements had changed. More careful now, more focused. Kids say things. "William Patterson," Marisol said, reading from her transcript notes. "Commander, Bud S. Class 187. The knife stopped moving. Duncan turned slowly, his expression shifting into something Marisol recognized from his Army Reserve days. The look that meant someone had made a mistake they didn't know about yet. "Wait," he said. "Bill Patterson. You know him. Know of him." Duncan put down the knife and crossed to the table. "Marisol, pull up his name, right now." She typed it into Google. The results populated slowly, each line adding weight to what had happened in Courtroom 4B. CDR William H. Patterson, USN retired, obituary. Navy SEAL, receives Silver Star for action. Patterson, William H., NS $1,000 Community Memorial. The first image result showed a man in dress whites with multiple rows of ribbons across his chest. Duncan leaned over her shoulder, reading. His voice dropped to something quiet and serious. Silver Star. Bronze. Star with Valor. 28 years. Most of his service jackets probably still classified. He sat down heavily in the chair beside her. That judge just publicly humiliated a child for telling the truth about a genuine American hero. Marisol looked at her husband. "What do I do with this? Is it in the court record?" "Every word. Every word." Duncan stared at the laptop screen for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "I know someone at JAG," he said, "not to file anything official, just to make sure the right people know a service member's family was disrespected." He looked at his wife. "In the military, when someone disrespects a fallen SEAL's granddaughter, yeah, it'll do something." He stood and walked into the living room, phone to his ear. Marisol stayed at the kitchen table, looking at Commander Patterson's obituary, looking at the photo of him in uniform, looking at the list of commendations that went on for 3 paragraphs. Somewhere in the foster system, a 12-year-old girl was carrying his challenge coin and being told she was a liar. The gap between those two facts felt like something that needed to be corrected. In another office, in another building, a phone rang. A hand picked it up. A voice said, "Talk to me." And on the other end, Duncan Paith began explaining what had happened in the courtroom 4B. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, the person on the other end sat quietly for a moment, then opened their computer and began typing an email with the subject line, "Family Matter Requiring Review." By morning, that email would be forwarded 4 times. By the end of the week, it would reach people who had served with Commander William Patterson, people who remembered him, people who took certain things seriously. But none of that had happened yet. Right now, it was just Wednesday evening, just a court reporter and her husband having dinner, just a caseworker making phone calls, just a 12-year-old girl, lying in bed in a foster home, holding a challenge coin, and wondering if telling the truth had cost her the only stable placement she'd had in 2 years. If you've ever watched someone tell the truth and not be believed, if you've ever known someone whose legacy was bigger than the space they took up in the world, take a moment to share their story. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is make sure people aren't forgotten. And if this story resonates with you, if you believe that truth should matter more than assumptions, consider subscribing. Because what happens next proves that some systems, when they work the way they're supposed to, protect the people who can't protect themselves. 5 days passed before anything visible changed. 5 days of Ember going to school and sitting through classes where teachers asked if she was paying attention when really she was somewhere else entirely. 5 days of Geneva making dinner and pretending not to notice that Ember barely touched her food. 5 days of Lorelei sending text updates that said things like, "still waiting," and these things take time, as if time were something Ember had in unlimited supply instead of something measured in 2-week increments before a judge made his decision. What Ember didn't know was that in those 5 days, her name had appeared on screens in offices she would never see. In a military records facility in San Diego, a clerk processing routine Freedom of Information Act requests typed Patterson, William H. into a database and watched as an automated cross-reference check flagged something unexpected. An alert box appeared on her screen. Family inquiry pending. Callaway, E. Relationship, granddaughter. The clerk paused, read the notation twice, then added her own note to the file. Request verification, civilian incident reported. She clicked send, and the email traveled through secure channels to people whose job descriptions included phrases like community advocacy and family support coordination. In Norfolk, Virginia, a paralegal at the Judge Advocate General's office opened that email at 9:23 a.m. on a Monday morning. The subject line read, civilian incident involving deceased NS Dazaler's member. She highlighted a sentence in the body of the text. Minor dependent subjected to public ridicule regarding service record in family court proceeding. She forwarded it to her supervisor with a priority flag and a single sentence. Verify relation. If confirmed, request judicial review parameters. By Tuesday afternoon, 3 more people had read the email. By Wednesday, it was marked urgent. In an office with no nameplate on the door and no identifying features except a memorial wall covered in photographs of men in uniform, a phone rang. The man who answered had weathered hands and gray hair, and the particular stillness that comes from decades of making decisions under pressure. He listened to Duncan Peath explain what had happened in Courtroom 4B. He asked 2 questions. Where is the child now? What was the judge's name? Then he said, "Send me everything," and hung up. He sat at his desk for 3 minutes without moving. Then he opened his computer and began making a list of names. People who had served with Bill Patterson. People who would care that his granddaughter had been humiliated by someone who should have known better. On Thursday morning, a woman at the Navy SEAL Foundation in San Diego received an email on her tablet. The subject line was Patterson Family Alert. She read it standing in front of the memorial wall, directly beneath a photograph of Commander William Patterson in dress whites. Below his photo, an engraved plaque, 1963 to 2021. The only easy day was yesterday. She read the email twice, then picked up her phone and started making calls. By Thursday evening, 43 people had been contacted. By Friday morning, 17 of them had responded, asking what they could do to help. None of this was visible to Ember. She went to school, she came home. She did her homework at the kitchen table while Geneva cooked and Marco fixed a squeaking door hinge and Petra practiced spelling words out loud. Simon asked her once if she was okay, and she said yes because what else was there to say? The hearing had happened. The words had been spoken. The damage was done. All that remained was waiting to see if the truth mattered less than a judge's assumptions. But in Courtroom 4B, business continued as usual. Judge Grimshaw arrived each morning at 8:45 a.m., exactly 15 minutes before his first scheduled hearing. He reviewed case files in his chambers while drinking coffee from a mug that said, "World's Best Dad, a Father's Day gift from a decade ago." He presided over custody disputes and placement reviews and termination of parental rights hearings, with the efficient detachment of someone who had stopped seeing individuals years ago and now saw only categories: cooperative parents, difficult parents, kids who would make it, kids who probably wouldn't. On Tuesday morning, his clerk Theodore Muntz entered the chambers with the usual stack of mail and messages. He set them on the desk with more hesitation than normal. "Your Honor," he said, "about that administrative review I mentioned last week." Grimshaw looked up from his case notes. "What about it?" "They've requested the full transcript from the Callaway hearing." Theodore shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "And they want to schedule a deposition." "With you." "For what case?" Grimshaw's tone suggested this was an annoyance rather than a concern. The one where the girl claimed her grandfather was a Navy SEAL. Grimshaw removed his reading glasses and set them on the desk, with the careful precision of someone who found other people's incompetence exhausting. Someone at judicial conduct has too much time on their hands. "Schedule it. I'll explain we can't operate on fairy tales and coach testimony." He went back to his notes, already dismissing the conversation. "Sir?" Theodore's voice had changed slightly. "Did you verify the claim?" "About the grandfather." Now Grimshaw looked up with visible irritation. "Verify what?" "A 12-year-old's fantasy. It's just that protocol usually requires some kind of documentation check before—" "Theodore." Grimshaw's voice went cold and flat. "I've presided over 7,000 cases. I know coach testimony when I hear it. The girl had no documentation in her file. No corroboration from previous caseworkers. Just a convenient story that happened to align with wanting to stay in her current placement." He picked up his pen. "Schedule the deposition. This will take 15 minutes. Theodore left, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to push further. Grimshaw returned to his work. He had 3 more hearings that day and 4 the next, and his reappointment to the bench was coming up in 6 months, and everything was proceeding exactly as it had for the past 14 years. He saw no reason why anything would change. That evening, Ember sat in her bedroom at the Threadgill house. The room was small but had a window that looked out onto the backyard where Marco was building a raised garden bed. The walls were painted pale blue. Geneva had let her choose the color when she moved in. There were 3 items on her nightstand arranged with the careful attention of someone for whom possessions were scarce and meaningful. The challenge coin. A folded American flag from her grandfather's funeral. 1 photograph in a simple wooden frame. She picked up the photograph. It had been taken 4 years ago at Ocean Beach. She was 7 in the picture, sitting on her grandfather's shoulders, both of them laughing at something her grandfather's friend had said while taking the photo. The ocean was visible in the background. Her grandfather was wearing a faded blue t-shirt and board shorts and sunglasses pushed up on his head. He looked happy. She looked happy. The world had felt safer then, in ways she couldn't articulate but could remember in her body. The feeling of his hands holding her ankles so she wouldn't fall. The sound of his laugh. The way he smelled like salt water and coffee. She set the photograph back on the nightstand. "Grandpa," she whispered to the empty room, "I wasn't lying, I promise." The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. She lay down and pulled her pillow close and tried not to think about what would happen if Judge Grimshaw decided the Threadgills weren't the right placement. Tried not to imagine packing her few belongings into garbage bags again and moving to a new house with new rules and new people who would take months to trust, if she ever trusted them at all. In his home office that same evening, Judge Grimshaw sat at a mahogany desk, reviewing briefs for an upcoming case. Classical music played softly from speakers mounted on the wall. Everything in the room communicated success and control. Law school diplomas in expensive frames. Photograph of him shaking hands with a senator. Shelves lined with legal volumes he hadn't opened in years, but kept for the appearance of scholarship. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife about dinner reservations for Friday night. He responded with a thumbs-up emoji and went back to work. Theodore's question about verification lingered at the edge of his thoughts for maybe 30 seconds before he dismissed it. The system worked because judges made decisions based on evidence and credibility assessments. The Callaway girl had presented no evidence. Her demeanor had been coached. Her story had been implausible. He had made the correct call based on available information. That was what judges did. If people didn't like it, they could appeal. That was what the system was for. What he didn't know was that at that exact moment, Captain Rhett Osler was sitting in his study in Point Loma, reading an email that made his jaw tighten with anger he hadn't felt in years. The email included an attached transcript from Courtroom 4B. Osler read it twice. Then he read it a third time, paying attention to the specific words Grimshaw had used. Fabricating a military hero grandfather. Let me guess, he also worked for the CIA. The casual cruelty of it. The public humiliation of a child who had already lost more than most adults could handle. Osler looked at the photographs on his wall. There were dozens of them. Training photos from BIS, deployment photos from Iraq and Afghanistan, group shots from reunions where men who had faced death together tried to pretend they were just regular guys having beers. In several of the photos, Bill Patterson was visible, laughing, serious, focused. The best operator Osler had ever worked with, and one of the best men he'd ever known. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He found the number he wanted and pressed call. It rang 3 times before a voice answered. Yeah, Rhett Osler. I need the contact list from Bill. Patterson's memorial service. Pause. Yeah, the Team 3 reunion list too. Longer pause. Because someone just disrespected his granddaughter in a courtroom, and I want every single person who served with him to know about it. Over the next 2 hours, Osler made 11 phone calls. Each conversation followed a similar pattern, an explanation of what had happened, a reading of specific excerpts from the transcript, a question about whether the person wanted to help. Every single person said yes. In a construction trailer outside Oceanside, a man in his 50s covered in drywall dust answered his phone and listened. His expression changed from curiosity to anger to something colder and more focused. When the call ended, he stood there holding the phone for a full minute before setting it down and walking out to tell his crew he needed to take a personal day. In a law office in downtown San Diego, a woman in a business suit stepped out of a meeting to check her phone. She read the text, messaged twice, then excused herself and went to her office and closed the door. She pulled up the Navy SEAL Foundation website and navigated to the memorial page for William Patterson. She stared at his photograph for a long time. Then she opened her email and started typing. In a backyard in Coronado, an older man was tending his garden when his phone rang. He listened to the explanation without interrupting. When it was finished, he asked one question. What do we need to do? The answer was already being handled, but there was something else. The girl might need to see that people remembered, that her grandfather's service meant something to more people than just her. The older man said he would be there, whatever was needed, wherever it was. He would be there. By the end of the week, 17 people had confirmed they would travel to attend a custody hearing for a child most of them had never met. They would take time off work. They would arrange flights and rental cars and hotel rooms. They would put on their dress uniforms or their most professional civilian clothes. They would show up because that was what you did when someone from your community needed help, especially when that someone was the granddaughter of a man who had saved lives at the cost of his own. On the following Tuesday, Lorelei Goet sat in her office long after her official work hours had ended. The building was mostly empty. The fluorescent lights in the hallway had that particular quality of institutional spaces after dark. She had her desk lamp on and her computer screen glowing and 3 different windows open with information she had spent the past week gathering. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had been given by someone at the Department of Defense Family Advocacy Office. It rang 4 times before someone answered. This is Lorelei Goet with Child Protective Services. I need to verify information about a deceased service member. Pause. William Patterson. Commander. Navy. SEAL. Pause. The family relationship is his granddaughter, currently in foster care. There was a civilian incident involving her testimony about his service, and I need confirmation before I proceed. The person on the other end asked several questions. Lorelei answered them with the precision of someone who had learned that details mattered more than dramatic presentation. She provided case numbers and dates and the specific language Judge Grimshaw had used. She explained that the child had a challenge coin, but that the judge had never asked to see it. She said the words public humiliation and pattern of dismissiveness and failure to verify claims before making credibility determinations. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the voice said, I need to put you on hold. The hold music was generic and vaguely patriotic. Lorelei waited. After 6 minutes, the voice came back. Ms. Goet, I can confirm that Commander William Patterson served for 28 years with Naval Special Warfare. I can confirm that his granddaughter's identity has been verified through estate settlement records that included DNA confirmation for inheritance purposes. I can also tell you that this incident is now being reviewed at levels above standard judicial conduct procedures. What does that mean? Lorelei asked. It means that when a judge publicly disrespects a fallen service member's family without doing basic verification, people take it seriously. The voice paused. It also means that child should know her grandfather's service record is not in question, not by anyone who matters. Lorelei thanked them and hung up. She stared at her notepad where she had been taking notes during the call. Patterson confirmed seal. 28 years active service. Silver Star 2004. Details classified. Bronze Star with Valor, 3 awards. KIA details sealed. JSOC operation. Granddaughter relationship verified via DNA. She circled the word verified 3 times. Then she picked up a different phone and made a different call, this time to the office handling Judge Grimshaw's administrative review. She identified herself and her case number and said she had documentation the judge should have requested but didn't. She said she could provide evidence that contradicted his credibility assessment of a minor in his courtroom. She used words like pattern and failure of due diligence and constitutional concerns about arbitrary decision-making. The person on the other end said they would add her information to the review file. They said a deposition had already been scheduled with Judge Grimshaw. They said the timeline had been moved up due to the nature of the complaint. 2 weeks after the initial hearing, Judge Grimshaw sat in a conference room in the Judicial Conduct Office. The room had beige walls and a long table and no windows. His attorney, Lawrence Kepler, sat beside him, looking professionally bored. Across the table, 2 investigators. One was a woman in her 40s with reading glasses and a leather folder full of documents. The other was a man in his 50s with gray hair and the expression of someone who had heard every excuse and believed none of them. The woman opened her folder and removed a document. She slid it across the table. Judge Grimshaw, this is a transcript from the custody review hearing for Ember Calloway on October 16th. Are you familiar with this proceeding? Grimshaw glanced at it. Yes. The woman put on her reading glasses and read from the transcript. Quote, fabricating a military hero grandfather undermines everything we're trying to accomplish here. Did you make that statement to Ms. Calloway? If it's in the transcript, then yes. Grimshaw's tone was confident, almost bored. And you made this statement because you believed the child was lying about her grandfather's military service. I had no evidence she was telling the truth. Grimshaw leaned back slightly. Children in foster care often say things they believe will help their placement situation. It's a common pattern. Did you ask to see any documentation? The male investigator asked. She didn't offer any. Grimshaw's voice had an edge now. But did you ask? Kepler intervened smoothly. Your Honor doesn't have to justify evidentiary procedures in a custody hearing. Judicial discretion. Actually, the female investigator said, cutting him off with surgical precision. He does when it's part of a conduct review. She slid another document across the table. This is Commander William Patterson's service record. Redacted for classification purposes, but sufficient to establish he was indeed a Navy SEAL. 28 years of service. Multiple commendations, including a Silver Star and 3 Bronze Stars with Valor device. Grimshaw picked up the document. His face went pale as he read. He looked up. This wasn't in the case file. Did you check? The male investigator asked. Silence. Grimshaw didn't answer. The female investigator pulled out an evidence bag and placed it on the table between them. Inside was the challenge coin, gold trident worn smooth, the engraving visible through the plastic. She left it there, centered perfectly in Grimshaw's line of sight. Commander Patterson died 3 years ago during an operation that remains classified. His granddaughter Ember Calloway was left with no immediate family and entered foster care 4 months later. She carries this as one of 2 personal items from his estate. Would you like to examine it? Grimshaw stared at the coin. He didn't reach for it. For the first time since entering the room, he looked uncertain. The male investigator leaned forward. Judge Grimshaw, what you need to understand is that you didn't just make a mistake. You publicly humiliated a grieving child for telling the truth about her deceased grandfather's military service. In open court, in front of a gallery, while demonstrating zero effort to verify her claim before labeling her a liar. The female investigator slid a third document across the table. We're also reviewing transcripts from 19 other cases. There's a pattern of dismissiveness toward minor testimony, particularly from foster youth and children from unstable backgrounds. This isn't about one bad day. This is about a systemic failure to treat vulnerable children with the basic respect required by your position. I didn't know, Grimshaw said quietly. It was the first time his voice had lost its confidence. That's precisely the problem, the female investigator said. You didn't care to know. There was a long silence. She closed her folder. We should also inform you that several active duty personnel have made inquiries about this case. The Navy SEAL Foundation has reached out. The Family Advocacy Office at DoD is monitoring the situation. This is drawing attention at levels that extend beyond standard judicial review. From the military, Grimshaw asked, and now there was something like fear in his voice. Commander Patterson was highly respected, the male investigator said. His community doesn't take disrespect lightly, particularly when it involves his orphaned granddaughter, who has no one else to advocate for her. The deposition continued for another 40 minutes, but the outcome was already clear. When it ended, Grimshaw and Kepler walked to the parking garage in silence. They reached Grimshaw's car before either of them spoke. How bad is this? Grimshaw asked. Kepler chose his words carefully. Depends on whether the board wants to embarrass you or remove you. Remove me, for one case, for 19 cases showing a pattern, for publicly mocking a dead war hero's granddaughter, for not doing basic due diligence. Kepler paused. And because it's political now. The military is watching. If the board doesn't act, it looks like they're protecting you over a SEAL's family. That's not a good look for anyone. So, what do I do? Hope they offer you a quiet exit. Kepler unlocked his own car and got in, leaving Grimshaw standing alone in the concrete structure. That same afternoon, Ember was in her room doing homework when she heard a car pull up outside. She looked out the window and saw Lorelai's vehicle. Her stomach dropped. Unscheduled visits meant news, and news was rarely good. She went downstairs to find Geneva already opening the front door. They sat in the living room. Lorelai had her professional face on, but there was something different underneath it. Something that looked like carefully controlled satisfaction. Ember, she said, I wanted you to know that your case has been reassigned to a different judge. Ember felt the air leave her lungs. Why? Judge Grimshaw is no longer handling family court cases. There's an administrative review happening. I can't share all the details, but I need you to understand something. She leaned forward. I verified your grandfather's service record. Everything you said was true, and some people who knew him, people who served with him, they wanted to make sure you were being heard. People who knew Grandpa, Ember whispered. Lorelai nodded. Your new hearing is scheduled for next week. Judge Alondra Kress will be presiding. She specifically asked to meet with you. She said, and here Lorelai pulled out a handwritten note, I'd like to hear from Ember directly, and I've taken the time to learn about Commander Patterson. He sounds like he was remarkable. Something broke open in Ember's chest. Not relief exactly, something more complicated. The feeling of being seen after months of invisibility. She started crying and couldn't stop. Geneva moved closer and pulled her into a hug. Lorelai waited quietly, letting the moment be what it needed to be. When Ember could speak again, she asked the question that mattered most. Does this mean I can stay here? That's what we're going to find out, Lorelai said gently. But this time, you'll have a judge who's actually listening. After Lorelai left, Ember went back to her room. She picked up the challenge coin from her nightstand and held it in both hands. The metal was warm, the trident pressed into her palm. She thought about her grandfather and about the people she'd never met who had decided to care because he had mattered to them. She thought about systems that moved slowly, but could still move in the right direction if enough people pushed. She didn't know yet that 17 people in military dress uniforms would be sitting in the gallery at her next hearing. She didn't know that Captain Rhett Osler had cleared his entire schedule. She didn't know that Judge Grimshaw's nameplate was being removed from his chamber door at that exact moment. She only knew that, for the first time in 3 weeks, the truth felt like it might actually matter. That maybe Geneva had been right. That sometimes it just took time to show up. If you've ever seen systems fail someone and then watched those same systems correct themselves, if you've ever witnessed the difference between authority, that demands respect and authority that earns it, share this story. Because what happens next shows that justice doesn't always announce itself with speeches and drama. Sometimes it just quietly shows up in a courtroom where people who remember have decided to be present. Consider subscribing if you want to see how this ends, because the next hearing won't be anything like the first. 3 weeks after Ember sat in courtroom 4B and was called a liar, she walked through the same courthouse doors with Lorelei beside her. The building looked identical. Same worn linoleum, same buzzing fluorescent lights, same smell of old paper and industrial cleaner. But something fundamental had shifted in a way Ember couldn't quite name. Maybe it was in Lorelei's posture, straighter and more certain than before. Maybe it was in the way the bailiff who checked them in made eye contact and nodded with what looked like respect. Or maybe it was just that Ember had learned the difference between being heard and being dismissed, and she was about to find out which one today would bring. They walked down the familiar hallway toward courtroom 4B. Ember's hand found her pocket where the challenge coin rested, warm from her body heat. She'd held it the entire drive over, rubbing her thumb across the trident until Lorelei gently suggested she might wear the design off completely. The joke had made Ember smile, which felt like a small victory in itself. When they reached the courtroom door, Lorelei paused. She crouched down so they were eye level, something she did when she needed Ember to really hear her. "Today is different," she said. "Judge Kress has reviewed everything. She knows who your grandfather was. She knows what happened at the last hearing, and there are some people here who wanted to support you. Okay?" Ember nodded, not quite understanding but trusting Lorelei in a way she'd learned not to trust most adults. They pushed through the door, and Ember stopped so abruptly that Lorelei nearly walked into her. The gallery was full, not just full, but filled with a kind of purpose that made the air feel heavier. 7 people in Navy dress white uniforms sat in the first 2 rows, 3 more in Marine Corps dress blues, several others in business attire, but with a bearing that suggested military background even in civilian clothes. Ember had been to enough of her grandfather's functions to recognize that particular way of sitting, that particular way of holding stillness. She stared at them. They stared back with expressions that ranged from solemn to openly emotional. One man in the front row, older with gray hair and rows of ribbons on his chest, gave her a small nod. Not a greeting exactly, more like an acknowledgement, like she was someone who deserved to be seen. "Who are they?" Ember whispered. "People who knew your grandfather?" Lorelei said quietly. "People who wanted to be here." Before Ember could process that, the bailiff's voice cut through the room. "All rise." The one's Honorable Judge Alondra Kress presiding. Everyone stood. The rustle of fabric and the creak of wooden benches filled the space. Then Judge Kress entered. She was in her 50s with dark hair pulled back and an expression that somehow managed to be both authoritative and genuinely warm. She took the bench and surveyed the room, her gaze lingering on the uniformed personnel with something that looked like understanding. Then she looked directly at Ember and her expression softened. "Please be seated," Judge Kress said. There was a collective sound of people sitting. The room settled into a different kind of quiet than Ember remembered from 3 weeks ago. This quiet felt attentive rather than dismissive. "Ms. Calloway," Judge Kress continued, her voice carrying clearly without being loud, "please come forward." Ember walked to the same chair she'd sat in before. Lorelei took the seat beside her. Everything was the same, and nothing was the same. The same wood paneling, the same elevated bench. But the person behind it was looking at her like she was a human being rather than a case number. Judge Kress folded her hands on the bench and leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Calloway." "Ember. I've read your entire file. I've also read the transcript from your previous hearing. Before we begin the formal proceedings, I want you to know something. Everything you said about your grandfather was true. Commander William Patterson served with distinction for 28 years. He was a decorated Navy SEAL who saved lives and served his country with honor, and I am deeply sorry that you weren't believed when you spoke about him." Ember felt tears start immediately. She tried to hold them back, but they came anyway, hot and fast. She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, embarrassed, but Judge Kress didn't look away or hurry her. She just waited with the patience of someone who understood that some things needed time. "I also want you to know," Judge Kress continued, "that several people who served with your grandfather asked if they could be present today. They're not here to testify or to influence my decision. They're here because they wanted to show support for Commander Patterson's granddaughter. I allowed it because I believe you deserve to know how much your grandfather was respected." She paused. Is that all right with you?" Ember nodded, not trusting her voice. The man in the front row with gray hair and ribbons stood slowly. He was tall and moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying emotional weight. He walked to the barrier that separated the gallery from the front of the courtroom and stopped. Judge Kress nodded permission. The man looked at Ember. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "Ember, my name is Rhett Osler, Captain retired. I served with your grandfather for 6 years, 2 deployments in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. He saved my life twice. Once in Ramadi when I did something stupid and he pulled me out of a situation that should have killed me. And once during Hell Week in Bud S training when I was 23 years old and ready to quit because I thought I wasn't strong enough. He pulled something from his pocket, a challenge coin identical to the one in Ember's hand. He held it up so she could see. Your grandfather gave me this when I made it through Hell Week. He grabbed me by the shoulders when I was sitting in the sand ready to ring the bell, and he said, 'Osler, the only easy day was yesterday. Stop living in yesterday and move through today.' He said that, and I stayed, and I made it because he believed I could." Ember was crying openly now. "That's what he said to me," she managed, "every morning, when I didn't want to go to school or when I was scared." Captain Osler smiled through his own tears. "Of course he did, because that's who Bill Patterson was. He never gave up on his people." He turned slightly to address Judge Kress, but kept his body angled toward Ember. "Your grandfather talked about you, constantly, called you his toughest teammate, said you were braver than half the guys in his platoon. He showed everyone pictures of you at the beach, at your school plays, at everything. He was so proud of you." Something in Ember's chest felt like it was breaking open in a way that hurt and healed at the same time. "He said that. About me. All the time." Captain Osler's voice caught. "Ember, I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner, after the operation, after he died. We didn't know where you'd ended up in the system, but we know now. And every person in this room is here because your grandfather mattered to us. Because you matter to us." He gestured to the gallery. Several of the uniformed personnel nodded. One man, younger, maybe in his 30s, stood briefly. Captain Osler indicated him. "That's Lieutenant Marcus Wade. He was on the ground when your grandfather died. Your grandfather pushed him out of the line of fire and took the hit himself. Marcus is alive today because of what your grandfather did. So are 2 other operators who couldn't be here today, but who wanted me to tell you that they're thinking about you." Lieutenant Wade remained standing. His face was composed, but his jaw was tight with emotion. He nodded once to Ember, a gesture that said more than words could. Then he sat down. Captain Osler turned back to Judge Kress. "Your Honor, Commander Patterson's memorial fund has been dormant since his death. 17 of us here today, plus about 40 others who couldn't make it, have agreed to reactivate it, specifically to support Ember's education, stability, and whatever she needs moving forward. We understand she's in a good foster placement with the Threadgill family. We want to ensure it stays that way, and that she has resources for college and beyond." Judge Kress nodded slowly, visibly moved. "That is extraordinarily generous, Captain Osler. It's the least we can do," he replied. Then he looked back at Ember. His voice dropped lower, more intimate. "Meant just for her, even though everyone could hear. Your grandfather was the best man I ever knew. You deserve to be somewhere safe, somewhere people believe you when you tell the truth, somewhere people see you for who you are, not just a case file. You deserve to know that Bill Patterson died doing what he always did, protecting his team, making sure everyone else got home. He was a hero in every sense of that word, and you have every right to be proud of him." Ember couldn't speak. She could only nod and cry and feel the weight of all these strangers who weren't strangers because they'd loved the same person she'd loved. Captain Osler returned to his seat. The courtroom was absolutely silent, except for the sound of Ember trying to breathe through her tears. Judge Kress gave her a moment. Then she spoke gently. "Ember, we're here today to determine what placement serves your best interests. I've reviewed all the reports from your caseworker, your teachers, your therapist, and the Threadgill family. I've also taken the time to understand who your grandfather was and what he meant to you." She paused. "I'm going to ask you directly, and I want you to know that your answer matters. It will be heard, and it will be respected. Do you want to remain with the Threadgill family?" "Yes," Ember said. Her voice was stronger than she expected. "Why?" Ember thought carefully. "Because they listen. When I told them about my grandpa, they didn't need proof. They just believed me. Because Geneva told me the truth always matters even when it takes time to show up. She looked at Judge Kress, and she was right. The truth did show up. It just took longer than I thought. Judge Kress wrote something down. Then she looked up and her expression was clear and final. Based on everything I've reviewed, and based on my conversation with you today, I find that continued placement with the Threadgill family serves your best interests. You'll remain with them. I'm also ordering that the Commander, William Patterson Memorial Fund, be designated as a supplemental educational and welfare resource for you, administered through a trust until you turn 18. She looked at the veterans in the gallery. Gentlemen, ladies, thank you for being here today. This is what justice should look like. People showing up for someone who can't advocate for themselves. People remembering. People honoring a legacy by taking care of those left behind. Several of the veterans nodded. One woman in navy dress whites wiped tears from her eyes. The Marine Corps personnel sat at attention, backs straight, faces composed but deeply engaged. Judge Kress turned back to Ember. One more thing. What happened to you in this courtroom 3 weeks ago should never have happened. It was wrong. It failed you. And I want you to know that the system, imperfect as it is, caught that failure. Not perfectly, not fast enough, but it caught it because people did their jobs, because your caseworker verified the truth, because your grandfather's community spoke up, because documentation matters, and credibility isn't just about whether an adult believes a child. It's about whether that adult does the work to verify before making judgments. She paused, and her voice became even more direct. Your voice mattered, Ember. It always did. Even when it felt like no one was listening, it mattered. And I hope you remember that going forward, that you have a right to be heard, that truth has weight, that the people who love you, whether they're here or gone, they're still protecting you in ways you might not see until later. Judge Kress picked up her gavel. This hearing is adjourned. Ember, you're free to go home. The gavel came down with a sound that felt less like an ending and more like a door opening. People stood. Ember stood. Lorelei put a hand on her shoulder and squeezed gently. Around them, the courtroom began to move, but several of the veterans approached first. Captain Osler came forward again. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small card. This has my contact information, he said, handing it to Ember, and the information for the Memorial Fund Coordinator. If you ever need anything at all, you call. We take care of our own. And you're one of ours. Other veterans approached. Lieutenant Wade shook her hand with a grip that was firm but careful, like he understood she was still a kid. A woman introduced herself as Commander Sarah Voss, retired, who had worked logistics for Ember's grandfather's team. She said Bill talked about you every single day, and she said it with such conviction that Ember believed her completely. One by one, they introduced themselves. Each one offered a memory. Each one made clear that this wasn't charity or pity. This was family. The kind you built through shared experience and mutual respect. The kind that didn't disappear just because the person connecting you was gone. Geneva and Marco had been sitting in the back. They came forward. Now, and Geneva wrapped Ember in a hug that felt like safety, made physical. We're going home, Geneva whispered. All of us. Together. They left the courtroom surrounded by people in uniform. They walked down the hallway past the same doors and the same scuffed tiles. But everything felt different. When they reached the lobby, Captain Osler and several others accompanied them to the parking lot. They stood in the California sun making plans to stay in touch, to meet for dinner, to make sure Ember knew she had a network that extended far beyond one foster family. As they drove away, Ember watched through the rear window as the veterans stood together in the parking lot. They were talking among themselves now, probably sharing stories about her grandfather, probably reinforcing their commitment to watch over her. The distance grew, and they became smaller, and then they were gone, but the feeling of being held by something larger than herself remained. That evening, while Ember was eating, dinner with the Threadgills and laughing at something Petra said about her teacher, Judge Phineas Grimshaw was packing boxes in his chambers. The room felt cavernous and empty. His diplomas were already down, leaving dark rectangles on the wall where they'd hung for 14 years. His books were in boxes. His desk was nearly clear, except for a few personal items he was deciding whether to keep or throw away. His nameplate had been removed from the door that morning. He'd watched a maintenance worker unscrew it and replace it with one that read Judge Alondra Kress. Nobody had said anything. Nobody had offered sympathy or asked if he needed help packing. He'd simply become invisible in the same building where he'd once held authority. The administrative review had concluded with an offer: resign voluntarily or face formal removal proceedings that would be public and would detail every case where his conduct had failed to meet standards. He'd chosen resignation. His attorney had called it the smart choice. Grimshaw called it the only choice when the alternative was public humiliation. His phone had been buzzing all day with messages from colleagues, some expressing concern, most maintaining professional distance. Nobody wanted to be associated with a judge who'd been forced out, especially not for something that made the news. Local paper had run a headline: County Family Court Judge Resigns Amid Conduct Review. The article mentioned a pattern of dismissiveness toward minors, but didn't name Ember or her grandfather, professional courtesy to protect a child's privacy, even as they documented the failure that had cost him everything. He carried a box to his car. The parking garage was empty. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. His footsteps echoed. He loaded the box into his trunk and stood there for a moment, staring at nothing. He'd presided over 7,000 cases. He'd been respected. He'd been efficient. He'd believed he was good at his job, and maybe he had been by certain metrics. But metrics didn't account for the 12-year-old girl whose truth he'd dismissed, because verifying it would have required effort he hadn't thought was worth spending. 3 more trips, 3 more boxes. Then his chambers were empty and he was standing in a hallway that no longer belonged to him. He walked out of the courthouse and drove home and sat in his kitchen with the lights off, thinking about challenge coins and military service and the difference between authority and respect. 6 months passed. Ember turned 13. The Threadgills had a party with a cake that Geneva baked and decorations that Marco hung and presents that included books and art supplies and a new backpack for school. Captain Osler sent a card with a gift certificate for a bookstore and a note that said, "Your grandfather loved to read. Keep that going." Commander Voss sent a framed photograph of Ember's grandfather in dress whites that Ember didn't have. Lieutenant Wade sent a handwritten letter about the day her grandfather saved his life. Details he hadn't shared in court, but wanted her to have. The memorial fund was reactivated and growing. Ember received statements showing contributions from people whose names she didn't recognize, but who had all served with or known her grandfather. The fund would pay for college, for housing, for anything she needed to build a stable future. It wasn't charity. It was a promise kept by people who understood that taking care of each other didn't end when someone died. It extended to the people they'd loved and left behind. On Memorial Day, Geneva asked if Ember wanted to visit her grandfather's grave. They drove to the National Cemetery where white headstones stretched in precise rows across perfectly maintained grass. American flags had been placed at every grave. Families moved quietly between the markers, leaving flowers and standing in silence and remembering. Ember's grandfather's headstone was simple: CDR William H. Patterson, U.S. Navy, SEAL Team 3, 1963 to 2021, Silver Star, Bronze Star. Below that, engraved in smaller letters, the only easy day was yesterday. Fresh flowers were already there, left by someone else who'd visited earlier. Ember knelt and placed her own flowers beside them. She set the challenge coin against the base of the stone, the trident catching sunlight. "They believe me, Grandpa," she said quietly. Geneva and Marco stood back, giving her space. "I wanted you to know. People you served with came to court. Captain Osler was there. He told me what you said about me, that I was your toughest teammate." She paused, wiping tears. "I'm staying with Geneva. They're adopting me next month. I'm going to be okay. I promise." She touched the stone. The granite was warm from the sun. She stayed there for a few more minutes, not saying anything, just being present. Then she stood and turned to go and stopped. 20 feet away, Captain Osler and 5 other veterans in civilian clothes stood quietly. They'd come to pay their respects too. When Osler saw her looking, he raised his hand in a small wave. She waved back. No words were needed. They were both here for the same person, both honoring the same memory. As they walked back to the car, Ember looked out at the rows of white stones, each one a life, each one someone's grandfather or mother or sibling, each one a story about service and sacrifice, and the people left behind to carry forward. She thought about systems that failed and systems that corrected, about truth that took time but eventually arrived, about the difference between being heard and being believed. 4 years later, Ember sat in her high school counselor's office filling out college applications. She was 16 now, more confident, more certain of who she was and where she'd come from. The essay prompt asked her to describe a challenge she'd overcome. She'd written about her grandfather and about the courtroom and about learning that justice wasn't always fast, but could still be real. Her counselor read the essay and looked up. You don't talk much about the judge, about not being believed. Ember thought about that, because that's not really the story. The story is what happened after. How people I'd never met made sure I was okay because they respected someone I loved. That's what my grandpa would want me to remember. Not the person who failed to see me, but all the people who showed up when it mattered. The counselor nodded. You're more forgiving than most people would be. I'm not forgiving, Ember said. I'm just clear about the difference between justice and revenge. Justice is slow. It's boring. It happens in offices and through paperwork, not in dramatic speeches. But it's real, and it's enough. She was accepted to San Diego State University with a full scholarship from the Patterson Memorial Fund. She studied social work because she wanted to help kids in the system, kids who needed someone to actually listen. On her dorm room desk, she kept 3 things: the challenge coin, the photograph of her and her grandfather at the beach, and a card from Judge Kress that said, "Never stop telling the truth, even when it's hard." The cemetery visit became an annual tradition. Every Memorial Day, Ember went with Geneva and Marco and her siblings. And every year, Captain Osler and several veterans were there too. They'd stand together in the sun among the white stones and remember. They'd tell stories. They'd laugh at things Bill Patterson had said or done. They'd make sure Ember knew she was still part of something larger than herself. If you've known someone whose legacy lived on through the people who loved them, someone whose impact extended beyond their own life into the lives they touched, take a moment to honor them. Write their name somewhere. Tell someone their story. Because the best memorial isn't carved in stone, it's carried forward in how we treat each other. It's in showing up when someone needs us. It's in believing children when they tell us the truth. It's in doing the work to verify rather than dismiss. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that systems can still work when enough people care, consider subscribing. Not because you want more content, but because stories like this matter. Because remembering matters. Because the truth, given time, and people willing to fight for it, always finds its way home.